Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The United Nations General Assembly, world leaders in New York. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, major American Jewish organizations, joins me in studio. Malcolm's been meeting with world leaders these last days, and we're joined by someone who's very familiar with the same world leaders, John Bolton, former ambassador to the United Nations from the United States, now at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Bolton, a very good evening to you. It's a very rich time in New York, especially if you walk from the east side to the west side and don't require transportation. There's no way to get through the traffic when the UN's in town. However, I note that the president of Iran, Mr. Rouhani, answering questions in all directions, addressing the General Assembly. He was with Chuck Todd of the NBC, Meet the Press, earlier this afternoon, and I have a transcript in front of me, but I won't need to read the quotes. I'm sure you'll follow my lead here that Chuck Todd asked dutifully about Fordo, the secret facility for nuclear weapons development, we believe, that is under the agreement of the Iran deal said to be empty of those facilities, weapons, chances, building towards a weapon. And yet it has a first-rate ground-to-air system around it. It's been a puzzle for some weeks. When Chuck Todd asked Rouhani tonight, he smoothly didn't answer the question and said Iran has the right to defend itself. Is Iran openly defying the Iran deal and the U.S. is doing nothing? Good evening to you, John.
Good evening. Yes, of course they are. And Fordo is a good example. It was supposed to be converted into a research facility, but the Russians have now, after many years of delay, begun shipping a very sophisticated air defense system, the so-called S-300, that is capable of defeating any aircraft other than stealth aircraft. And as these systems are installed around Iran's nuclear facilities, it becomes clearer and clearer that the regime is just going to keep moving right along toward nuclear weapons. And the high point of the day for me was Hassan Rouhani's speech at the UN, where he actually beat Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. It was Rouhani who won the Chutzpah of the Year award by criticizing the United States for violating the nuclear deal. I mean, really, these people have never had any serious intention of complying with the main provisions of the deal. They've made superficial, easily reversible concessions to get sanctions lifted and $150 billion of assets unfrozen. And now the Ayatollahs are off to the races on both the nuclear side and the ballistic missile side, leaving real instability and risk in their wake.
I understand from the meetings we had with some of the leaders who are visiting that the signatories to the JCPOA met with Iran. And do you have any indication about the nature of those discussions? Clearly, they're not holding Iran to account, not for the violations of the deal and not for the outrageous behavior interfering with our shipping, our air flights, the human rights violations, and again, another arrest of an American in Iran.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and it demonstrates that not only is Iran not complying with the letter or the spirit of the agreement itself, their behavior in the broader international context has not changed one little bit, and it gives the lie to what I think is the foundational reasoning of President Obama for why this deal was in American interest, supposedly, is that it would not only solve the Iranian nuclear problem, it would solve Iran's long-standing behavior as the world's central banker of international terrorism and chief threat to peace and security in the Middle East. And none of that has changed. I thought Speaker of the House Paul Ryan the other day, really, it was one of his finest moments when he called John Kerry a shill for the Iranians, basically acting as the president of the Tehran Chamber of Commerce. And I think a lot of what was happening in that meeting of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Germany and Iran, the parties that put together the nuclear deal, that they were trying to calm the foreign minister of Iran down, who had a long list of specific complaints that didn't come out in Rouhani's speech, but that it just shows a few days before this meeting, the U.S. gave licenses to both Boeing and Airbus to sell Iran the latest models of jet passenger airplanes, which of course have military purposes as well. And that potential huge windfall for Iran wasn't enough to stop Rouhani from making a public complaint or stop Jared Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, from elaborating on it at length in the private meeting.
It's 100 planes altogether, John, which is more than Iran Air has now.
No, it's a phenomenal. It just shows exactly what Iran understood it was going to get from this deal. Enormous economic benefit and very few meaningful constraints on its nuclear program.
Syria. John Kerry is accusing Russia of bombing that convoy purposefully or accidentally. In any event, Rouhani was asked about it and said, by the way, the U.S. bombs Syria and Israel bombs Syria, so it's all very confusing. Is Iran exempt from moral concerns in the Middle East, John? Does the U.S. give Iran license to be cute about the Syrian civil war?
Well, I think the Iranians have sized up Barack Obama and John Kerry very accurately. They see they are desperate to keep this nuclear deal going. I thought President Obama's speech to the General Assembly on Tuesday was noteworthy for several reasons, but one of which was that he absolutely lashed himself to the mast of the Iran deal as the principal foreign policy accomplishment of his administration. And as they have known throughout the negotiations that led to the agreement in the summer of 2015, the Ayatollahs know today that Obama will not do anything that might cause the deal to come unstuck. So it gives the Tehran regime continued bargaining leverage to extract further concessions and more benign interpretations of the deal itself, and gives them license to continue outrageous behavior in the region, such as their support for the Assad regime in Syria, and so on and so on and so on.
And moral hazard. We've created a moral hazard. Iran is exempt from being judged for its own conduct.
Well, and so are the Russians, except when it gets in the way of John Kerry's ceasefire. I mean, it's the sort of behavior that feeds Vladimir Putin's instinct that he knows his mark in the White House as well, and it's why I've thought for some time that the period between now and Inauguration Day in the United States, January 20th of next year, will be a period of real vulnerability as adversaries like Putin test Obama one more time before he leaves office.
And quickly, could you give us an assessment? There's another election taking place that nobody's paying attention to, but clearly has great significance, and that's for the next Secretary General. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a final decision, yet there are straw votes now. What's your assessment of the process and who's likely to be at the forefront after this vote?
Well, it's much more confused than I expected it to be. The notion that an Eastern European would win because it was the turn of their geographical group, not yet clear. I'd say it's still very much up in the air.
And the choice of a woman is also no longer, it seems to be a dominant consideration.
Yeah, it's a factor, but it doesn't look like it's going to prevail, at least at this point. I don't rule out another candidate coming into the race unexpectedly. I think there's still a lot to play for here.
And the Russians cleverly maneuvered it into October, when they will be in the chair of the Security Council, which will give them additional influence. Even though the Permanent Five have a veto, it will certainly affect the process.
Well, this is a high-stakes proposition for Russia, if indeed an Eastern European becomes Secretary General, because the risk to Russia is very high. It's why they've got their candidates, preferred candidates, Irina Bokova of Bulgaria. They want somebody who reminds them of Eastern Europeans during the Cold War days. A lot of Eastern Europeans that want exactly the opposite. The Russians, I think, won't permit that. So that's one reason that this is still, I think, very hard to predict the outcome.
And no NATO member either, they said, and set other restrictions, which I think will make it an interesting race. It'll be a very interesting study for political scientists afterwards. I've met with most of the candidates, and I think they're just as confused as we are about where it
does Barack Obama, John, does Barack Obama want to be General Secretary, and is that credible?
Well, I think he wants to be. He wants some position that will allow him to continue to preach to the rest of the world, and he hasn't found it yet. But don't lose sight of what that objective is.
Malcolm, do you have a pick? Do you have right now your instincts of where it's going?
Having met with most of them, and I'm meeting another one tomorrow. It's very hard. I mean, there are competent people, but to see somebody who could really be a unifying factor that the permanent five wouldn't have something against is somebody from Argentina unacceptable to Britain. Is the Russians have the restrictions that John Bolton indicated. The U.S. doesn't like some of the candidates because of things that happened in years past. It's going to have to be heavy negotiating, I think, and that's what John is alluding to, that it's not going to be a clear process where somebody will emerge as the obvious candidate.
And does Vladimir Putin have a veto, John? Is that what you have to find a candidate acceptable to Moscow?
No, exactly, and they have to find a candidate acceptable to us. You know, when we elected Ban Ki-moon Secretary General 10 years ago, I sat down in a room with the Chinese ambassador, and having consulted with Secretary of State Rice, I knew where she wanted to go, and we basically cut the deal that brought Ban Ki-moon into that position. And I think at some point the U.S. and Russian ambassadors are going to have a similar kind of meeting and say, we either reach agreement on somebody or we're going to be here for a long time.
John Bolton of the American Enterprise Institute, Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.